So, when we're looking at the evergreen materia medica, we're really looking at a pretty broad range of medicinal trees. And that ranges anywhere from the pines, the spruces, the hemlocks, the firs, the cedars. There's a whole lot of different evergreen trees out there all across the world. But what we see is that a lot of them display very similar medicinal properties. So I'm kind of lumping them all together, which is not something I tend to do. But really, for the most part, a lot of these herbs have a lot of crossover properties. So I'm going to be speaking to them in relatively general terms here. Each one sometimes has some unique specificities about it. But we're just going to be discussing kind of some of those evergreens in general here. So what we see almost universally across these trees, for the most part, we're using, the green leafy material, the needles, the brush basically, and that's not exactly, of course, the technical botanical term for it, but we're using the leaves. And what we see pretty much across the board with all of these trees is they have a very nice, distinct, pungent, aromatic flavor to them. And that is because pretty much all of these have within them volatile oils, right? These are very terpene-rich trees, meaning that the plant is producing these volatile aromatic essential oils actually as part of that tree's innate immune system. Really, it's a defense mechanism. If we think, here in the Pacific Northwest, it's super damp all of the time. And, unfortunately, up here, a lot of the old growth has been logged because logging is one of the major industries here in the Pacific Northwest. But, we've seen, some stumps, unfortunately, only the stumps, but from, very, very old Western red cedars that, literally are like 20 feet in diameter. I mean, they're absolutely huge. If you think about that, a tree that can live to grow that large, live for hundreds and hundreds of years in an incredibly damp environment, it has to be able to protect itself from things like fungi, from bacteria, from things that will eat away at the wood and ultimately kill the tree. And so pretty much universally, the evergreens all produce these very nice, distinct, aromatic, volatile oils that are very terpene rich. Alpha pinene, beta pinene, alpha and beta philandrine. There's lots of different constituents in these plants, but universally these all have a very nice antiseptic, antimicrobial action. And so that's one of the main ways that these trees are used as kind of like a general broad spectrum antiseptic. When we're looking at the affinities of these plants, though, most of them have a very strong affinity for the upper respiratory tract. The throat, the bronchioles, the lungs, down into the lower respiratory tract. Some I find get a little bit deeper than others, but the respiratory tract is really one of the primary affinities for these trees. And if we couple that respiratory tract affinity with it being an antiseptic, right, we have a very nice combination of an herb that is typically used to treat respiratory tract or respiratory route infections. And this is how cross-culturally evergreens have been used all across the world for this purpose very, very effectively. So the respiratory tract is what I see as the primary affinity for these herbs. Some of our trees, I mean, they're herbs, we use them medicinally. For some reason, sometimes trees and herbs, we think of herbs as like, plants as distinct from trees, but it's an herb. And so we do see other affinities for some other evergreens, especially things like the junipers tend to have a very strong affinity for the kidneys and the urinary tract, also having antiseptic properties there. We also would say that some of these have a bit of an affinity for the immune system. And this I'm really thinking oftentimes in terms of like, especially like the fresh fir tips. At least that's what we have here in the Northwest. We got tons of Douglas fir here in the forest. And in the springtime, you get those really bright green fir tips are extremely rich in vitamin C. So while pungency is really the main flavor profile for a lot of these remedies, the fresh growth actually has a very distinct sour flavor to it. Very, very rich in vitamin C. They're really, really tasty. Like fir tip tea is really nice. Now, vitamin C is a polysaccharide, and it's said that you know, really, really hot water kind of denatures that property. So you know, I like to just eat them, you know, eat the fir tips while you're walking through the forest. You get a nice, kind of freshens your breath up, and you know, gives you a really nice dose of vitamin C, along with all of the other bioflavonoids that are going to be present, right? We got to remember vitamin C is not just ascorbic acid. That's a very reductionistic way of thinking about it. We have to remember that ascorbic acid is really much more active when it's present with all of the host of other bioflavonoids that go along with it in nature, the way nature intended. So respiratory tract, urinary tract, and because they're volatile oil rich, many of them will probably warm the gut, bring a little bit of a carminative effect. That's not typically how they're used, but you know, most things with volatile oils will be slightly carminative for the digestive system, as well as warming circulation a little bit, and that's going to really vary depending on how pungent and kind of hot and spicy and aromatic those volatile oils are. So when we're thinking about the actions, right, I mentioned carminative, slightly circulatory stimulant, but the main one here is these are great expectorant remedies. So when we're thinking volatile oils, typically will have an affinity for the respiratory tract. This is because as soon as they enter your mouth, which is a warm environment, those constituents are volatile, right? They want to float around in the air. So you put those herbs in your mouth, whether that's through a tea or through a tincture, you know, some of those volatile constituents are going to remain in your mouth. You take a breath and you're going to breathe them right into your lungs. And because they're pungent and warming in nature, they're going to have much more of a stimulant expectorant effect. So we're going to see these plants being very, very nice for, or trees, being very nice for typically cold, damp, phlegmatic, stagnant, kind of stuck respiratory tract conditions. Really, really nice for a cough. Some of them are very nice at kind of opening up the lungs. Like when folks sometimes have hard time breathing, it's just kind of, it's like that kind of, they're not antispasmodic in my experience with them, but they do kind of seem to have this opening effect. And I think that's because volatile oils in general have this up and outward movement. They tend to kind of expand and radiate. They kind of open things up. When things get too cold and damp, the vital force moves down and in. And the volatile oils are kind of the opposite of that, right? So warming and drying in their energetic property here. And some might consider them to be stimulant in their effect as well, just because they are so warming and they drive circulation a little bit and things like that. So